To me a couple weeks ago and said, God's really been speaking to me about some things, and I would really like to share it. He said, would that be possible? And I said, yeah, sure, that'd be fine. So when do you want to do it? And he said, well, I need July 1st to work. And I said, okay. So let me backtrack a little bit here. I remember when he was about, when did you get baptized? When you were 4? 5? I remember when he got baptized when he was 5, talking about Colby. He has been a very, very integral part of our family. He's had a major impact on our family, spiritually and emotionally. We love him. I remember when he was a young man, we had about an 80-year-old minister come to our church from California, and he fell in love with Colby because Colby was little, maybe 6. Went up to him and said, I'm going to be a minister. I'm going to preach the word someday, so what do I need to do to get ready? So this man named Moses Bay said, what do you tell you to do, Colby?
Read a proverb every day.
Read a proverb every day. He was about 80 years old at the time. He is now since went to be with the Lord. He was a great man of God, and he just loved Colby, thought he was awesome that a 5, 6-year-old kid would say, I'm going to be a minister. What do I need to do to get ready? So with that this morning, the reason he picked July 1st to minister to us is today is his birthday. So Colby is 17 today. And we're going to sing happy birthday in a second just to embarrass him, because that's what uncles do. But I'm excited, and I think a big part of who we are as a church and as a community is one of the things I love about our church is we help young ministers rise up and learn and grow in the Lord. We've got Sydney leading our worship, and I love that. She's a young minister, and she's so teachable, and she's willing to learn and ask us questions. And sometimes before you guys ever get here, we have some really good insight and talks about what worship is and everything. It's really awesome, and it's just part of who we are as a church. It's part of my heart is to raise up young ministers and to see them branch out and go do the work of the Lord. It's who we are. And so this morning we're going to sing happy birthday to him, and then he's going to come preach to us in his socks. I said, you put shoes on? He said, no, if it's okay, I'm going to preach in my socks. And I said, absolutely. So, Caleb played barefooted, Sydney plays barefooted, so Colby's got to do the sock thing. So let's all sing happy birthday to him, and then we're going to bring Colby up. Ready? 1, 2, 3. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Colby Jack. Happy birthday to you. Amen. All right, if you would, please give your attention to Mr. Colby, as this is his first time he is going to minister from the pulpit. Remember this day, because this kid's going places.
Thank you all. You're too kind, all that good stuff. I want to tell Uncle Rick thank you for letting me do this. I'm really excited about it. And so before I get started, I'm going to tell you a story of how I got here. And it all starts Wednesday at Passion Camp. And so I'll give you the rundown. So I woke up that morning. I got to sleep in that day. Really happy about it because we didn't have to wake up and go learn our chants and stuff that day. And we went up and we did our squad wars, and we all were super excited. And then we went to lunch, had tacos that day. Great day. I like to watch the kids pick the beans and all the chicken and stuff out of their tacos. It was funny to me. And then we went to the ocean. And y'all were here a couple of Sundays ago when we told you this story. I lost my glasses in the ocean. Like, they fell off my face, a wave hit me. How am I going to find my glasses? Crawling around on my hands and knees on the sandbar, I feel them and I find them. Great things happen, right? And so, I'm so happy, like, you have no idea. Like, I was going to die, my mom was going to kill me. Like, it would have been bad. She would have had to, like, UPS some overnight my glasses down, because I couldn't have got through. I can't see anything. I'm super, super blind. And so all that happens, and then a big storm comes, which is another thing. If I wouldn't have found my glasses in that first 5 minutes there, they would have been pulled out to sea in the storm. So, it started to rain. And at our hotel, we have this big parking garage, and it had this curved concrete ramp to get up there. And the kids thought, this would be a good slip and slide, as from Indiana. doing that everywhere. And we have a little video I sent to Sam, and I think we're going to pull it up here and see what happens. So there's all sliding down. Luke's my favorite. Wow, he was watching. And just a couple seconds after this video ends, this is the same thing again. Just a couple seconds after this video ends, Sydney goes down, cuts her leg open. Blood shooting out the side of her leg. It's not that bad, just a little scrape. But she was bleeding. You can see the blood running down her leg. Really funny. And so I laughed like really hard about it. Anyway, so this is really where the story happens. So we go to worship that night, and we have an awesome worship. Crowder was there and stuff, and he's always great. And then Louis gives this message, and it's all about being. He says in Christianity, we think of us being good or bad. They're like, when you ask somebody, "Are you going to go to heaven?" and they say yes, and you say why, and they say because I'm a good person. And that's not the reason that you go to heaven. It's because you're alive or dead in the spirit if you ask God to come into your life, right? So after he gave that message, I'm like, I'm alive. So what's the next step here? And that's when I started thinking about all this stuff. And before we get into my actual message, I'm going to pray, and then we'll get into it. So, God, thank you for this day, and thank you for everything that you've given to me, God. I thank you for this opportunity to come and preach your word, because it comes straight from you. It's nothing from me. It's all you, God. God, I pray that we have open hearts. It's crazy how you work, how we had this list, God, today, all about opening our hearts and all about our righteousness, God. And I pray that we keep that door open for you today. In Jesus' name I pray, amen. So I'm going to start with a little scripture, and then we'll start talking about it. So Matthew 5:13 says, "You are the salt of the earth, but if the salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled by men. You are the light of the world, a city on a hill that cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on a stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before men, that they may see your good deeds and praise your Father in heaven. Do not think I've come to abolish the law of the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. I tell you the truth, until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter, not the least stroke of a pen will by any means disappear from the law, until everything is accomplished. Anyone who breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do so will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever practices and teaches these commandments will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you," this is important, "unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you certainly will not enter the kingdom of heaven." So I bolded the words that are important up there. The least, the great, and you will not enter. And we'll dig through all that today. But first, I want to make something clear. You don't need to work for your salvation. That's not something that happens. Once you decide to give your life to God, you have your salvation. But if you truly are a son or daughter of God, it will make you want to be more pleasing to God, and you will change over time, right? You're not going to stay stagnant. And if you are, that should give you a little heart check. And that's what I think that this verse is really about. It's saying if you're not getting better, if your righteousness does not surpass just the legalistic law of the Pharisees, you're not going to inherit the kingdom of heaven because you truly haven't accepted God, right? So it should give us this heart check. Have I truly accepted Jesus to be my Savior? No. Am I willing to set aside the desires of my flesh and strive to be more like Jesus because I simply want to be in your presence? Is what you need to ask yourself. And I hope so. And if the answer is yes, then what can I do to be more pleasing to God? What can I do to be more like Jesus? Because that's the best thing that we can do to please God. While sitting on top of a mountain and talking to his followers, he gives us the outline on how to do these things. now that we know that we are alive, we can begin to ask how we can become more like Jesus. Where should we look? Sermon on the Mount. We just read the first part of it. It's super cool. The Sermon on the Mount is one of my favorites. It's Jesus' favorite. It's his most famous service, and it's because he's the only one to ever fully accomplish it. No one else in the history of Earth has ever fully went out and done everything that he says to do here. It can only be accomplished by him because he's perfect, right? And that's crazy. I like that a lot. So I have 4 takeaways, 1 big takeaway, and then 3 little things that come after it. So my big thing that I want us all to have today is to have a renewed understanding of what it means to follow Jesus. And to do that, it makes us ask 3 questions. What does it look like to fully serve Jesus? Why do we follow Jesus' teaching, his life, right? And we need to know, why do people commit sins? And once we figure those things out, then I feel like we've fully conquered the Sermon on the Mount. So one common idea that people like to preach about with the Sermon on the Mount is that Jesus is just saying how to live a good life, how to live the Christian life. He's saying you should pray and you shouldn't give to the poor and you shouldn't lie, but that's not true. And we can tell that that's not true because when we go to Matthew chapter 7, at the very, very tail end of his sermon, he tells us this. He says, "Not everyone who says, 'Lord, Lord,' will enter the kingdom of heaven. Will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only he who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. Many will say on that day, 'Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, and did we not drive demons and perform many miracles?' And I will tell them plainly, 'I never knew you. Away from me, you evildoer.'" So that should be the scariest thing that we ever hear, right? That just scared you. But being a Christian is so much more than that, and so much more than just saying Christian good and sinners bad, right? It's so much more, and that's what's awesome about Christianity. Jesus gives us 3 scenarios to prove that there are. He gives us 3 scenarios to show that he's talking more about that. He's contrasting 2 different things. He's not just saying do good or do bad. He's giving us 3 different. He's giving us a way to gauge what we're doing. He tells us in his sermon that there is a wide gate and there's a narrow gate. He tells us that there's a tree that bears good fruit and a tree that bears bad fruit. He tells us that there's a house that's built on the rock and a house that's built on the sand. All these scenarios are very similar. In fact, they only have one difference in each one of them. For the gate, it's as simple as the gate being all the way open or being very narrow. For the tree, it's as simple as it's bearing good fruit or it's bearing bad fruit. For the house, it's one that's built on a rock and one where it's built on sand. Where it's built, that's the only difference. This is so much more complex than living a good life or living a bad life. The things that he compares are not opposites. They're actually more similar than they are different. I think that I need to drive that home. Jesus here is referring to the differences between religious and righteous. Religious being the Pharisees and righteous being himself, right? Just like the other examples, there's only one difference between their lifestyles, your heart. You can follow all the laws, but if your heart's not in the right place, then it doesn't matter. Both look extremely similar, but they have opposite endings. The good fruit, the opposite is bad fruit. The house is still standing when it's built on the rock, and it falls when the rain comes, when it's on the sand. And the gate is the perfect metaphor for this too. In the narrow gate, where it's hard to get through, it leads to eternal happiness in heaven, and the wide one, where everybody can get through, it leads to absolute destruction, absolute sadness and misery. It's poison. It's absolute poison. So let's think about this. When Jesus was in the world as a man, and he went out and he lived his life, and he was teaching, living his life just by being an example, did he talk to the sinners and say, "Hey, you're a liar. Why are you like that? Why aren't you following the laws?" No. Instead, Jesus spent most of his time critiquing the religious people. And that's really important because because they're so close to righteousness. It's just the heart change it's a heart change that they need to make. He talked about how they were following the laws incorrectly, which is oxymoronic, but they're following with the wrong heart, and that doesn't matter. We never hear Jesus say, "Hey sinner, you need to pray." He'll say, "You pray like this, but I say pray like this." He doesn't say, "Here are people that give to the poor, and here are people that don't give to the poor." He says, "You give to the poor like this, and I say give to the poor like this." He doesn't say, "Here are people that lie, and here are people that don't lie." He says, "Here are people that lie for this reason, but I say don't lie for this reason." Right? He doesn't say that here are people that obey the Ten Commandments and here are people that don't. He says, "You obey like this, and I say obey like this." Both of these lifestyles are good. In both of these lifestyles, you're giving to the poor, and you're praying, and you're following the Ten Commandments. But if you don't have the right heart, if your mind isn't on God as you're doing it, if you're doing it for men and not for God, then it doesn't matter. It's not right. These lifestyles are so similar, and hearing that, it should scare you half to death, because it says, you'll be the greatest in the kingdom of heaven if you do all these things, but if your righteousness doesn't surpass that of the Pharisees, you won't enter the kingdom of heaven at all. That's scary. Both of these, I already said that. Listen to me. One is absolute damnation to hell, and one is eternal happiness, right? So when we go back to verse 19 in Matthew chapter 5, anyone who breaks the least of these commandments and teaches others to do so will be called the least in the kingdom of heaven. I just said this, but it's important. But whoever practices and teaches these commandments will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you, unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you certainly will not enter the kingdom of heaven. 19, you're either great or you're least. And 20 is you're not in the kingdom of heaven at all, right? That's absolute, it's crazy to me. What Jesus is saying is that your righteousness must surpass their righteousness. He's not saying that you're good and they're bad, or that they're good and that you're bad. You're both trying to do the right thing. Jesus says that Christianity surpasses religion tenfold. This is what's mind-boggling about Christianity. You don't have Buddha or Confucius or Muhammad telling you, you need to follow my laws with the right heart. No, they just say you need to follow the laws. We have all these laws set out, and you need to follow them. But Christianity is harder than that. It's a lot harder than that. It's something that you have to work your whole life to do. It's easy to follow the laws. It really is. Jesus says that's not good enough. You need to follow the laws, but you need to follow them with the right heart. We have people who say, Christianity, I thought, was leaving the immoral life and living according to the law. But Jesus says this isn't true. He says this is part of Christianity, but it's not the whole thing. Jesus says if you want to be in heaven, there is a righteousness that surpasses any religion out there. When we look at the life of Jesus, we can see that he was the most patient to the non-religious people, and that he had an awfully bad taste in his mouth about religious people, right? All of his life was spent critiquing the religious people. He disliked how they gave his father a bad name while they were following the laws. Matthew 5:16 says that in the same way, let your light shine before men that they may see the good deeds of your Father in heaven. They weren't doing it for God. They were doing it for themselves. They were doing it so they'd say, look at me, I'm doing all these good things. So I feel like a good example of this is Uncle Rick tells a story pretty often of when they had a bus ministry at their old church, and all of the little kids came and they were running around and they were loud and they were rambunctious and all that bad stuff, really. And they had people in the church who said they can't come back anymore. They're tearing up the church. They're doing all these bad things. In their heart, they were trying to do what they thought was the right thing. They're trying to keep God's house nice, and they're trying to keep it a friendly environment. But their heart wasn't in the right spot, right? That's what it all comes back down to. I hope that makes sense. Jesus is about to give us some more examples. As we dig through this sermon, we will see that Jesus is not condemning the abhorrent sinners. Instead, he spends his time rejecting the ways that religious people follow the laws. Verses 27, 31, 33, 38, and 43 all say, you have heard that this sin, that you shouldn't do it, but I say this. And we'll go through all of those. Jesus is less concerned with the external as he is with the heart. He doesn't care at all about the external. He doesn't care about external consequences. He cares all about the internal. And the Pharisees, the teachers of the law, the religious people, they only care about the external. And that's where the change happens. He says that you religious people, you can have the external. You can do all the right things, but without the right heart, you are nothing. You're not going to get in there. But, get this, is my favorite part. If you have the right heart, the external comes along with it. If you have the external, you don't necessarily have the heart, but if you have the heart, then the external comes with it. That's awesome. So, let's dig through this. He starts off with murder. So, he says, you have heard it said, long ago, do not murder. And anyone who murders is breaking the Ten Commandments, right? But I say to you, listen to this, if in your heart you have disdain for someone, or you've called them a fool, or you have ill will towards them, you have killed them. This is just as bad as the physical. He's saying if in your heart, if you've dismissed someone, if you don't care about them, if you're indifferent towards them, you've already killed them in your heart. It's the same thing as the physical. It's just as bad. It's no different. Then he moves on to adultery and sex. And Jesus says, you've heard it said that you shouldn't commit adultery. And the Christian look at this issue is no sex outside of marriage. Why? Let me tell you. So, the theology behind this is this. Whenever you are when you're going to do this thing with somebody, you are asking for outward the external nakedness and vulnerability, but you don't have the integrity or guts in your heart to fully give them your inner nakedness and vulnerability, and that's what marriage is, right? If you're not fully willing to open up somebody on the inside, why should you do it on the outside? That's what Jesus is saying. And so, once again, Jesus says, if you don't have the integrity or the guts to lay out your heart in front of this person, but you want everything else to be out in the open physically, that's lust. And even when you do this in fantasy, when it's just in your mind at somebody walking down the street, you're stabbing yourself in the heart all the way through. It's lust, Jesus says. Religious people say, as long as you're not committing adultery, then you're okay. But Jesus says, no, I don't care about the external, I care about the internal. Then he moves on to oaths and lies. And he says, once again, you have heard it said that when you commit yourself to a promise, you should follow through with it. Jesus says that the religious people, that they have manipulated this to the external. You have signed an agreement, now if you don't follow through, the lawyers are going to come after you. And Jesus says the external doesn't matter. He says that's not what's important. I don't care about the external consequences. I care about your heart. He said, but I say, let your yes be yes, and let your no be no. What he means by this is that your heart should be so full of integrity that every time that you say yes and every time that you say no, you should feel the same commitment as if you had just sworn on a stack of Bibles. Your heart should have that much integrity behind everything that you say, and you should have every intention to do everything that you say. And if you don't, then you're sinning. This one is probably my favorite sin that he talks about, and we'll talk about why in just a second. Retribution, turning the other cheek, right? We've all heard that. You've heard it said you should not seek revenge on other people once they've wronged you. And he says that they're going to break your heart 7 times, 70 times. He tells Peter that, right? And it's going to happen. It's inevitable. He says, but I say you should go a step further. Turn the other cheek. What does that mean, right? Turn the other cheek. So usually when we think about that, we say, turn the other cheek so he can hit you again, right? Like, I used to think that that's what it meant, but I was wrong. And I'm super happy about being wrong because it's awesome what he really means there. This is like literally the best thing ever. I love it. Even after someone has went as far as to hit you, Jesus says, not only refrain from hitting back, which can be hard enough, But he says, turn the other cheek to leave the door open for a relationship. Turn the other cheek to see if he's going to kiss you. Turn the other cheek with full compassion and forgiveness in your heart, saying, if this person's willing to come around and love me again, I'm willing to love them again too. Right? And even if they don't, I'm willing to love them. Right? I hope that they will come around. How awesome is that, right? This grace is just like so amazing to me. Jesus, and that's wrong page. Here we go. Jesus says that Jesus says that if you're going to confront someone, you should only approach them with hope and forgiveness, right? So if anyone's ever wronged you, you need to come to them with those two things, hope and forgiveness. And Jesus will always get you through. It's not your place to fight back and to try and get retribution for yourself, because that always ends up in badness. So now we got through the first chapter, wasn't too bad. Now we move on to giving, which is in chapter 6. And we're like, how's giving a sin? Jesus tells us how. We've moved to past the 10 Commandments now, and we've entered into the daily lives of the listeners. Jesus not only says, don't do your acts of righteousness in front of others. He says, be careful about it. He says, whenever you're doing something good, go out of your way to make sure that nobody knows that you're doing it. It needs to be just in between you, me, and the person that you're doing the good for. Because Pharisees would go out and they'd be like, everybody look, I'm about to bless this sick person here with this money that I have in my pocket, right? And that's not what it's about at all. And they do it because they want to be honored by men. They want to honor their flesh, and that's not what matters. Jesus says, I don't care about the external, I care about the internal. It should not matter if you're honored by men. Jesus says, don't be a hypocrite. Don't say that you're doing this in God's name and then declare for all to hear. Jesus says that when you declare your good deeds to others, you fully receive your reward that you're going to get. That praise is all that you're going to get. You're not going to get anything in heaven for it. If you truly give and do work for God, you will reap the rewards in heaven. Then he moves on to prayer. And I don't have a whole lot of time. I could stay here for an hour and talk about prayer, because prayer is awesome. And so I'm going to try and get through this quickly. If you really want to learn about prayer, you should read this prayer here in Matthew chapter 6. And that'll show you how to pray. And Romans 8 is also really good on prayer. This is the same idea of giving. He's saying don't pray with all your big words and cadences just so other people can hear you pray, just so you can hear yourself talk. It's so much more than that, right? It's more than just trying to make others think, man, this person is a religious person. This person is so close to God. Listen to how he talks to him. It's not about that at all. It's all about your connection and relationship on the inside. And that's all I'm going to say about that. Then he moves on to fasting, which is the same idea once again. Don't do it where other people can see you. He says, if you're going to fast, if you're going to try to get closer to me, don't manipulate it. Don't try and make it so other people are listening and watching you complain about being hungry. Or don't do it and say, man, I've been fasting and I've lost 14 pounds this week, man. Like, I've been eating beans only twice a day, and that's all I've been eating. That's all I've allotted myself. Like 200 calories a day, and see, it's working wonders on me. It's not about that. It's about getting closer to God, right? That's what it all comes back around to. He says he says that none of that matters. He says that it all goes back to your heart. And then he goes on to what he's been leading up to this whole time, with giving to the needy in prayer and fasting. He talks about your treasures in heaven. Jesus says it's senseless to build up wealth on earth where it will go away. He says it'll get rusted and moths will eat it. It doesn't matter. He says instead build up your treasures in heaven where nobody can get to it. And it's just between you and me. In Matthew 6, verse 24, we've all heard this one before. No one can serve two masters. Either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. Money is the external. Money is the immaculation of the external. That's what it all comes back to. the external is all about what you can get on earth, and money is how you do that. And Jesus says, don't love the money, love me instead. Love me, love what I've done for you. Jesus says you can't try to please men and please me. The flesh and other people will pressure you into loving money and the influence it brings over people instead of God, and we cannot let that happen. And then Jesus goes into this wonderful thing about not worrying. And if you treat this religiously, you can dig yourself into a pretty deep hole, and it's actually pretty fun. He says, and a religious person, when Jesus says you need to stop fearing things, and you don't need to have anxiety, and you need to stop worrying, then a religious person's just like, well, I guess I have to stop worrying. How am I going to do that? I just got to do it. Jesus says I have to, but by this point you're worrying about not worrying, and you've got yourself just trapped in this little circle here about trying to serve God, but you're worrying because Jesus says not to. You can't treat it religiously. Instead, Jesus says that you need to worry about the things that you can fix. If you can do something about it, fix it. But if you can't, then leave it to me. He says, think about the birds. Think how they fly in the sky, and I make sure that they have food, and I make sure that and that they have housing, and all this stuff. And if I care for them, when I care for you, he says, look at the lilies of the field. Think about how I've made them so that they can make their own food, and how pretty they are, and how people can look at them. And he says, if I care that much about them, think about all that I care about you. Think about all the value that you have. That's crazy. If he puts that much thought and effort into these things that don't really matter, think about all the effort and care and value that he puts into us. And once again, value, we get our value from God. We don't get our value from the world. And that's where all of our good things come from. It's from God. And the Sermon on the Mount is impossible. You can't do it unless you know that you're valuable. And Jesus knows that he's valuable because God's his Father. And guess what? God's our Father too. And that's sort of crazy to think about when you think about it like that. And this moves us on to our second to last point, and we'll move on from here. Why we follow God's lifestyle. This one's rather short, and the last one's a little bit more meaty. Religious people are seeking value. They want the praise of men. This is why they're alienating to others. When they're seeking value, and that's all that's on their heart, is getting value and making people think good of them or getting money, then people can see that in their lives. People think these people who are doing all these good things are really just doing it for themselves. They're not doing it for the people that they claim to love. It's much, and they can read through that. It's really simple to do. But this is what's awesome. Righteous people, the people like Jesus did this. They follow Jesus because of value. They follow him because they are valued. Instead of seeking value, they seek God because they are valued. They know that God will do anything for them. There's nothing that God wouldn't do to hold on to you. And I like this analogy a lot. God is not a boss. He's a father. So let's say we're out working and you mess up your report at your job, and your boss lets it slide one time, and then lets it slide a second time, but then the 10th time that you mess up, he says, hey, you gotta go, I can't keep you here anymore. But as a father, when you mess up the first time, your dad's gonna get a little angry, but he's gonna keep on loving you. And the 10th time, he's still gonna love you, he's still gonna be your dad. He's always gonna be your dad, right? And the 100th time, he's still gonna be your dad, probably gonna be a little bit more upset this time. But he's still your dad, right? No matter what, you can't change who your father is. You can change who your boss is, but God's always going to be your father. And I feel like it's important for us to not think of God as somebody that we're just trying to please so we can keep his love. We have his love locked away already, right? And the reason that religious people are so alienating is because they only do things to build up their own kingdom. And they think, if I help this old lady across the street, God will hear my prayers when I pray next time. Or if I help the poor, I can show how superior I am. Why do they pray? And why do they pray? For themselves. They pray so others can watch them. And that's why oftentimes their prayers lack repentance. And when you read about prayer, that's probably the most important part, is the repentance part, where you're showing that you are actually regretful for the sins that you've committed against God. And it's more than committing sins against man, because every time that you commit a sin against man, you are committing a sin against God. And this is why we judge, too, when we think about this. We hate to be introspective. It's a lot easier to pick out someone else's flaws than our own. Jesus says, stop being a hypocrite and take the plank out of your own eye before you point out a speck in your brother's eye. Because God is your Father, you must do right. And because God is giving you value, you must do right. I feel like that's probably the most important part. Because of God's love and grace for you, you should always want to do the right things for Him, and because of the value that He's given. And this is our last point, and it's a little meatier, but I think it's really cool. So I'm going to leave with this. I want us to think about why we sin. It always comes back to 2 points. You can always trace it back to one of these two things, either fear or pride, right? When we lie, it's because we're afraid of the consequences, or because we don't want to look worse, or we don't want to look worse than what we actually are in front of other people. That's prideful. And we're fearful because we don't want to face the consequences for something that we've done, right? So get this. This is the same reason that we don't lie religiously. Whenever religious people don't lie, they're doing it for the same reasons, because of fear and pride. Religious people don't lie because they're either afraid that God's going to strike them down because they've lied and committed a sin against Him, which He won't. Or, more likely, this is what we see more often, they are doing it out of pride, and they say, I don't lie. I'm not like those sinners who lie and do all these bad things. And that's what's killing the Big C church, I think. I think as we see the church population go down over the years, it's because religion is driving people out of the church. And if we want to change that, we all have to go back to righteousness, and we all have to circle back. But we have to circle back around and leave the external and take the internal and put it into our heart, right? And once we do that, then we're truly walking closer to God. And I feel like we can take a step back and look at what our takeaways were, which were a renewed understanding of what God is. And how we do that is, first of all, we need to know why we follow God, and that is because He's our Father, right? And He loves us immensely, and He'll never stop. Or, so what does it look like to live? I was trying to go through it. I'm breaking it. What does it look like to live a life like Jesus? So we talked about that as we dug through the Sermon on the Mount, and we talked about doing things on the internal is more important than on the external. Murder is the same on the inside as it is on the outside. Why do we follow Jesus' teaching in our life? Because of God's love, and because of God's grace, and because He loves us, and because He's our Father, and we want to please our Father because of all the good things that He's done for us. And why people commit sin? It's all about fear and pride. That's what it all comes back down to. And that was my last point. And like I said, if we want the church to be a better place, if we want to be lights on the hill, if we don't want our little light to be covered up by a bowl, then we have to put religion aside, and we have to all realize that righteousness is so much more important than religiosity, right? And the goal of Christianity is to be a light and to show God's goodness. And if we can't, and the only way to do that is to throw away the external and the law like the Pharisees did, because they were the opposite of what Jesus was, and be more like Jesus. And that's all I have. And so I'm going to pray, and we can be out of here today. God, I thank you for this day, and I thank you for this opportunity that you've given to us, God. I thank you that you've let us know that if our mind is on the flesh and on the external, then we're dead. But if our mind is on the Spirit, then we're alive and we're happy and we're going towards you, God. And God, I thank you that we can do things for you and not for men, because we'll never please men, but we can please you, God. We can reach your standards, and you'll always love us. God, thank you for this opportunity, and I pray that we get closer to you in our walk every day. In Jesus' name I pray, amen.